everyone. Thank you so much for joining us here in person and online as well. I'm really excited for today's lecture. My name is Anushka Lester, and I organise the lectures and the conferences here at the Society of Antiquaries. And Valerie and I have been corresponding for well over a year, I think, at this point. So I'm so excited that she is finally here and we get to have her lecture today. And I've been particularly excited about this one because, as you may know, I'm sure many of you will know, the Society of Antiquaries has been collecting a huge range of museum, library, and archive items over its 300+ year history. And one of those is our extraordinary Mary I portrait, which if you're here in the room, you can see, and if you're online, you'll be able to see online and on our website, and also for the lecture today. And so I'm really thrilled that Valerie is going to talk to us more about Mary I and help contextualize some of our collections. So Valerie Schutte is an independent scholar who has published widely on royal Tudor women, book dedications, and queenship. She has published 2 monographs, Mary I and the Art of Book Dedications, Royal Women, Power and Persuasion, and Princesses Mary and Elizabeth Tudor and the Gift Book Exchange. And she's currently writing a cultural biography of Anne of Cleves, which will be published with Routledge. She has co-edited or edited 7 volumes on Mary I, Shakespeare, and queenship, and her edited volumes Mary I in Writing, Letters, Literature, and Representations, and Writing Mary I, History, Historiography, and Fiction, won the 2023 Society for the Study of Early Modern Women and Gender Collaborative Project Award. You can see why she is the ideal person to be here today to tell us about Mary. Valerie is currently editing 2 other volumes, one on Tudor monarchs and myths, and the other on Mary I and humanism. So please join me in welcoming Valerie.
Thank you. I'm so excited to talk about Mary in the room with Mary. So I'm really excited to be here. In his 18 August 1554 report of the new English Queen, Venetian ambassador Giacomo Soranzo described Queen Mary as such. She is of low stature, with red and white complexion, and very thin. Her eyes are white and large, and her hair is reddish. Her face is round with a nose rather low and wide, and were not her age on the decline, she might be called handsome rather than contrary. Soranzo continued that Mary had a very spare diet and never eats until 1 or 2 p.m., although she rises at daybreak, when after saying her prayers and hearing Mass in private, she transacts business incessantly until after midnight. Furthermore, she is endowed with excellent ability and more than moderately read in Latin literature, and besides her native tongue, she speaks Latin, French, and Spanish, and understands Italian perfectly, but does not speak it. Mary was also a Catholic, enjoyed music and dancing, and loved to dress in resplendent garments. Soranzo's verbal portrait of Mary paints her to be the epitome of monarchy. Hardworking, merciful, educated, and magnificent. Finally, he reported, Mary makes great use of jewels, wearing them both on her chaperone and around her neck, and trimming for her gowns, in which jewels she delights greatly. And although she has a great plenty of them, left by her predecessors, yet were she better supplied with money than she is, she would doubtless buy many more. What follows is a close examination of one of Queen Mary's favorite jewels, the ring she was given at her coronation on the 1st of October, 1553. I pulled together her coronation, her rings, her famous Guildhall speech, her marriage, her portraiture, and to borrow the words of Stephen Greenblatt, her self-fashioning as a monarch through the lens of her coronation ring. Together, these threads give a more complete picture of Mary's reign, and I suggest that a close examination of Mary's coronation ring in ceremony, word, and portraiture can be understood as a piece of Mary's self-fashioning of her unprecedented role as Queen of England. Mary's coronation on the 1st of October emphasized that she was a virgin queen. Following tradition and precedent, that morning Mary journeyed by barge from Whitehall Palace to the Palace of Westminster. She was dressed in a blue velvet gown with a jeweled circlet or circular headpiece on her head. Mary entered Westminster Abbey under a gold canopy, and during the actual coronation ceremony, the Queen's new people assented to her being the rightful queen, after which Mary heard the liturgy and prostrated herself before the Eucharist. Bishop of Winchester Stephen Gardiner delivered a sermon on a topic of obedience, a topic especially pertinent after Lady Jane Grey's attempted accession. Mary then took the coronation oath and was anointed with oil. She was dressed and given the kingly regalia of the spur, sword, scepter, orb, as well as given the regalia of a queen consort, suggesting the complex blending of the coronation ceremony for Mary's unprecedented situation. A ring with a ruby was placed on the fourth finger of her right hand, a tradition enshrined in the little device, an instructional manual previously used for the coronations of Henry VII and Henry VIII. 3 crowns were successively placed on her head, and to conclude the coronation ceremony, Mary received homage from her clerics and lords, and finally, Gardiner officiated Mass. Mary's coronation oath is no longer extant, though she used a version of that oath that did not refer to the religious changes of the previous 2 regimes. Instead, she chose an old form of oath, which no mention was made of the new religion, but it was said that she should observe the laws of England, and in order to remove every uncertainty, she would have the words just and licit laws added. After thoroughly considering the oath she would take, Mary added a few words having for object to maintain her Majesty's integrity and goodwill. Importantly for Mary, the coronation, especially the oath, confirmed that she was firstly married to her kingdom, and she would consider its interests the same as her own. According to Sarah Duncan, Mary herself found the coronation important enough to evoke it. She made frequent, sometimes public references to the symbols of the coronation, particularly when she wanted to reinforce her kingly sovereignty or her own will. Often this took the form of Mary referencing her coronation oath and the ring that she wore that symbolized it. Mary particularly invoked her coronation oath and ring in discussions of marriage, reminding various ambassadors and counselors that she was already married to her kingdom. On the 15th of October, 1553, Imperial Ambassador Simon Renard wrote to Emperor Charles V regarding Mary's consideration of Philip of Spain as a possible bridegroom. Mary told Renard that she had not desired matrimony, but as God had called her to the throne and she had sworn to serve her country's interests, she had made up her mind to marry and chose a husband who should be able to provide for her kingdom's welfare and tranquility. Furthermore, Mary informed Renard some members of her privy council were in favor of her marrying Philip, but she wanted to see if the alliance would be favorable to England politically. Mary was also concerned that if it became an accomplished fact, and God were to bless it with a son or daughter, what his or her heritage should be, and whether your Majesty would conclude a close and defensive confederation. From the very outset, the discussions regarding her political marriage, Mary made it clear that she was only marrying because it was in the best interest of her kingdom, and the only way she could produce heirs. The most important role of a queen, whether she be regnant or consort. Renard assured Mary that Charles would grant conditions and a partition so equitable and just, a confederation so sure and binding, that she and her council would be satisfied, whether the posterity were to be a son or daughter. Clearly, Mary recalled her own position as King Henry VIII's only legitimate daughter and his quest to disinherit her in favor of having a legitimate son, and did not want the same thing to happen if she and Philip only had daughters. Though Charles, through Renard, may have simply been telling Mary what she wanted to hear, he likely would not have had a problem with her heirs being female, as their grandmother, Isabel of Castile, ruled successfully in her own right. After Renard told Mary of Philip's personality and even temperament, she then asked, before she had pronounced herself, whether it would be possible to see His Highness, and whether if I knew your Majesty had informed him that the alliance had been proposed. Mary's request to see Philip in person prior to their betrothal recalls her father's request to do the same when looking for his 4th wife, after the death of his 3rd wife, Jane Seymour, in October 1537. In June 1538, as Henry VIII entertained marrying a French princess, Sir Francis Bryan suggested that instead of sending portraits, Marguerite of Navarre, Francis I's sister, should chaperone Mary of Vendôme, Louise of Lorraine, and Renee of Guise on a visit to Henry so he could see them in person. Francis I denied the request, even though Henry pressed his case. In a conversation with French ambassador Perrault, Sieur de Castellion, Henry reportedly told him that he must see the women in person because I do not trust anybody but me. This is something that touches me too closely. I want to see them and get to know them for a while before I decide. Castellion, half laughing, replied, "Would you not want, sire, still to climb on each lady, one after the other, and afterwards to retain for your person that who will be the most gentle? The Knights of the Round Table did not spend their time treating the ladies in this country this way." His words had the intended effect on Henry, who laughed and blushed, realizing what he had asked was not exactly appropriate. And while Henry wanted to meet any potential brides prior to marrying one of them so as to nourish love, Mary likely wanted to meet Philip to make sure they were politically compatible, so as to get a better understanding of their potential to be co-monarchs of England. Ultimately, neither tutor met their spouse until only days before their respective weddings. As Mary and Renard continued to discuss their potential marriage to Philip, Mary showed concern as to how she would broach the matter with her Privy Council, some of whom were adamant she marry Edward Courtenay. In his recapping of events to Charles, Renard reported, "The phrase in my memorial about a husband who would be of no aid to the country had put into her mind of her coronation oath, as a reminder of which she wore a ring on her finger." In this conversation, Mary evoked her coronation oath and its physical embodiment in her coronation ring, to suggest that she ultimately was in charge of determining who her spouse would be, ensuring that he brought a useful political alliance. By the end of her 15 October meeting with Renard, it was clear that she thought Philip could be that husband. Just 3 weeks later, Mary invoked her coronation oath, though this time without mentioning her ring. On the 4th of November, Renard reported to Charles V that some of Mary's counselors were pressuring her to marry Edward Courtenay. Mary responded by telling that as the marriage touches her more nearer than anyone else in the world, she hopes they would not advise her to choose a husband against her inclinations, who might cause her to regret the step. As for the public good, she is mindful of it and of the oath she swore at her coronation, and desires wholly to perform her duty toward the crown. Again, Mary used her coronation to show both her responsibility to her kingdom, as well as emphasize her prerogative to make her own choices as England's queen regnant. The discussions of Mary's choice of husband continued throughout November. Again, some members of Mary's Privy Council implored the queen to marry quickly and to choose an English husband so as to secure the succession. Mary was offended that anyone would suggest that she marry one of her subjects, as no such suggestions would ever be made to a king. Furthermore, the queen warned, if she married against her will, she will not live 3 months and would have no children. She continued her rebuttal that she was mindful of the oath she had taken at her coronation, but which she was obliged to seek the good of the kingdom, and would pray God to counsel and inspire her in the choice of a husband who should be beneficial to the kingdom and agreeable to herself. As members of the Privy Council continued to push back on Mary's interest in marrying Philip, she continued to remind them of her coronation oath and the power and authority it gave her, each time seemingly more exasperated than the last. Not only did the coronation oath confer Mary the power to make her own choice, as it had done for every crowned king before her, she was sure that disobeying the oath would ensure that her reign would be childless. In choosing Philip as her husband, she was making a strong marital alliance, just as her mother had done before her. As Sarah Duncan astutely observes, repeatedly bringing up the subject of her first marriage afforded Mary the opportunity to reaffirm her own sovereign status. She might be in negotiations to become a wife, but as a queen, she had already wed a kingdom. Mary's ability to present herself as a queen, wife, virgin, and mother allowed her to work around her supposed gendered weakness and craft herself as a female king. Perhaps the most well-known invocation of Mary's coronation oath and ring occurred in the midst of Wyatt's rebellion in early 1554. The elements of Wyatt's rebellion are well known. Mary proposed marriage to Philip of Spain in late 1553, encouraged by the imperial ambassador Simon Renard and a faction led by William Paget, though opposed by France, a faction that wanted Mary to have an English husband, possibly Edward Courtenay, and Protestants who feared a Catholic restoration. The terms of Mary's marriage were proclaimed at Westminster on the 14th of January, 1554. After that, 4 conspirators, Sir Peter Carew, Sir James Croft, Sir Thomas Wyatt, and Henry Grey, Duke of Suffolk, planned an insurrection for Palm Sunday, the 18th of March, 1554, to coincide with Philip's journey to England. Yet plans were leaked and the rebels were forced to act in January. 3 of the 4 conspirators failed to raise armies, and only Wyatt marched on London with a following of 3,000 men. Mary appealed for support on the 1st of February, 1554, in a rousing speech at the Guildhall. Southwark welcomed Wyatt 2 days later as London Bridge was blocked. And on the 7th of February, Wyatt and his followers crossed at Kingston upon Thames, found Ludgate held by Lord William Howard, and surrendered to William Herbert, Earl of Pembroke. Mary later had Wyatt, Suffolk, and a few dozen others executed, including Guildford Dudley and Lady Jane Grey. Mary's half-sister Elizabeth and Anne of Cleves were also implicated, but were never found guilty of any wrongdoing, although Elizabeth was kept in the Tower for 8 weeks. According to William Robeson, the exact cause of Wyatt's rebellion remains ambiguous, with many considerations: religion, Hispanophobia, English nationalism, fear of foreign meddling, desire to replace Mary as queen, and the Black Legend of Spain. What can be said with certainty is that the rebellion had multiple overlapping causes. Both Mary and Wyatt had support, and that the instabilities and insecurities felt at Mary's accession and upcoming wedding were not so unique to her reign. Rebellions over politics and religion permeated medieval and early modern England, including the Peasants' Revolt of 1381, Buckingham's Rebellion of 1483, the Pilgrimage of Grace in 1536, and even Lady Jane Grey's illegal accession in July 1553. What was unique to Wyatt's rebellion was Mary's inspirational speech at the Guildhall to encourage her London subjects to support her against Wyatt and his followers. The herald Charles Risley recorded the event. On the morning of the 1st of February, a herald announced the capture of the Duke of Suffolk, the escape of Peter Carew into France, and that anyone who captured the traitor Thomas Wyatt would receive lands to him and his heirs forever. That afternoon, being Candlemas Eve, when Christmas decorations were removed and were burned to prepare for Candlemas, or the commemoration of the presentation of Jesus in the temple and the purification of Mary, the commons were gathered in their liveries in the Guildhall. At 3 o'clock, the Queen's Majesty with her lords and ladies riding from Westminster to the said hall, Mary went first to the council chamber and was then received by the Lord Mayor and aldermen on the steps going up to the mayor's court. Mary then went into the great hall, where was hanged a rich cloth of estate, and standing under it with her own mouth declared to the audience, there assembled the wicked pretense of the traitor Wyatt, which was utterly to deprive her of her crown and to spoil the city. Jonathan McGovern suggests that there are at least 12 contemporary or near contemporary versions of her speech, 11 of which were printed in the 16th century. Moira Duncan notes that John Proctor's The History of Wyatt's Rebellion and John Foxe's The Acts and Monuments contain the 2 most frequently cited versions of Mary's Guildhall speech. Foxe's version tends to be cited the most because the Acts and Monuments was so widely available in the 16th century with its frequent reprints. Though it has received some criticism since Foxe was not in England at the time Mary delivered her speech, and his English history has an obvious Protestant bias. Proctor's version is perhaps more authoritative because he was present at the time Mary delivered her oration and recorded it from memory. All extant versions of the speech have a similar retelling of events. Mary warns her subjects the dangers of rebellion, identifies Wyatt as a traitor, accuses the rebellion of trying to remove her as queen, identifies religion as a factor in the rebellion, mentions her coronation ring, considers herself married to the realm, legitimizes her rule as ordained by God, evokes her father and lineage as a tutor to justify her legitimacy, and declares herself a mother to her people. She explains she undertook the decision to marry very carefully with guidance from her privy council, and concludes by asking those defending her against Wyatt to act bravely. This presentation takes up one specific aspect of Mary's Guildhall speech, how she mentioned and used her coronation ring as an allegory of her marriage to England. According to Foxe, Mary declared, "I am your queen, to whom at my coronation, when I was wedded to the realm and to the laws of the same, the spousal ring whereof I have on my finger, which never hitherto was, nor hereafter shall be left off." Similarly, Proctor recalled Mary explaining, "I am already married to this commonwealth, and the faithful members of the same, the spousal ring whereof I have on my finger, which never hitherto nor shall hereafter be left off." In a shorter account by Cardinal Pole, he reported in a letter to the Cardinal de Monte that on the day of her coronation, when the ring which she wears was put on her finger, she purposed accepting the realm of England and its entire population as her children, and thenceforth was never intended to do anything but that was for their benefit. And thus would she do for the future, promising especially not to marry without the universal consent of Parliament. Mary's speech had just the right note of underlying feminine vulnerability, alluding to her disappointment that she did not yet have children of her own. And through the invocation of her coronation ring and oath, Mary assured them that her marriage would also come second to the needs of her people. This had the desired effect. Her speech, which was so nobly and with so good spirit declared, and with so loud a voice that all the people might hear her majesty, comforting their hearts with so sweet words that made them weep for joy to hear her majesty speak. After the queen left the great hall, she returned to the council chamber for a drink and took her barge back to Westminster. With this speech and the invocation of her coronation ring, Mary successfully rallied her people, and only days later, Wyatt was captured. Mary became wedded to her realm, greatly factored into her marriage with Philip later that year. On the 2nd of March, the Count of Egmont, a Spanish general and statesman, arrived in London to meet with Mary and her privy council to find out whether, if His Highness came over, his person would be safe, and what they desired should be done. Egmont brought with him the ratifications of the treaty, a power from His Highness to ratify on his behalf, the necessity briefs of dispensation because of the degree of consanguinity between the parties, and a power to contract the alliances by betrothal in person. Mary and her counselors saw no need to postpone the marriage. The rebellion was squashed and the rebels were in prison, and Philip should now have safe passage into England. The following Tuesday, the 6th of March at 3 o'clock in the afternoon, Egmont and Ambassador Renard attended Mary and her council for the betrothal ceremony. According to Renard and Egmont's report to Charles V, in a room where the Holy Sacrament stood, the ratifications of the Queen and His Highness were delivered and the requisite oath pronounced. But first the Queen knelt down and called God to witness that she had not consented to marry out of any carnal affection or desire, nor for any motive whatsoever, except her kingdom's honor and prosperity, and that the repose and tranquility of her subjects, and that her firm resolve was to keep the marriage and oath she had made to the crown. This she said with such a grace that all those present had tears in their eyes. Then, before the Bishop of Winchester, the promises and form proverba de presenti were intelligibly pronounced by Egmont and the Queen. Again, Mary privileged her marriage oath that she had made to the crown as taking precedent over her marriage with Philip. Additionally, she invoked her coronation oath and marriage to ensure her counselors that just because she was engaging in a physical marriage with Philip, that did not mean she would take her duties as queen any less seriously. Mary showed her royal prerogative and authority with this admission. It must have worked if all those in attendance burst into tears. Upon the commencement of this ceremony, the betrothal was officially contracted and ratified. Mary then knelt down once more and called upon those present to pray with her that God might give her the grace to accomplish the treaty on which she had sworn and favor her marriage, likely so that she would be blessed with many children. To symbolize the betrothal, Egmont gave Mary a ring from Charles V, which she showed to all the company. Renard and Egmont suggested that, "Indeed, sire, it is a jewel worthy to be seen," suggesting that Charles may not have seen it or even picked it out personally prior to Egmont taking it to London to give to Mary. With that, Egmont prepared to leave so that he could take the ratified marriage treaty back to Spain. Egmont asked Mary if she had any message to send His Highness, meaning Philip, and Mary desired Egmont to tell Philip that she would behave dutifully to him all her life long. As far as Renard and Egmont could tell, the betrothal ceremony went smoothly and met the approval of Mary and her counselors. All that was left was for the marriage ceremony and consummation to take place. Philip finally arrived at Southampton on the 20th of July in 1554, and the royal couple was married 5 days later. According to John Elder, the Queen's marriage ring was a plain hoop of gold without any stone in it, for that was, as it said, is her pleasure, because maids were so often married with a plain gold band in olden times. It is entirely possible Mary chose a simple band because it followed an old tradition. Yet she might have also chosen the band for its simplicity when worn with her coronation ring, rather than wearing 2 rings with gems on the same finger. If so, this would give credence to Mary envisioning her marriage to her realm as more important than her marriage to Philip. And finally, and what the rest of this presentation will focus on, is Mary's spousal ring in portraiture. Please bear with me as I'm still working through some of these ideas and gathering as many portraits as I can with rings, because they're not always visible. According to Diana Scarisbrick, the Renaissance jewel did not just display wealth and rank, it asserted political loyalties, cultural interests, and religious faith. The rings Mary wears in her portraits are no different. So, as you can see next to you, the Society of Antiquaries owns this magnificent 3/4 length portrait of Mary completed by Hans Ewerth that was likely the first painting of Mary as queen. Typically, the painting is dated to about January or February 1554, around the time of Wyatt's rebellion, though there is no explanation to explain exactly when it was painted. Ewerth was Mary's principal court painter and painted his English subjects in the style of Holbein, and his family came from a family of goldsmiths, so he paid particular attention to jewels in his portrait and was even given access to Mary's jewels. In this portrait, Mary wears a cross that belonged to her mother, as well as a large table diamond pendant hung with a large pearl that first belonged to Catherine Parr. And from her belt hangs a reliquary, supposedly containing a sliver of the true cross on which Jesus was crucified. Mary also wears 2 rings on her right hand and 4 rings on her left. Importantly, she does not wear a ring on the 4th finger or ring finger of her right hand, where the coronation ring should have been placed during her coronation ceremony. This means that Mary moved it to wear on a different finger after her coronation. All the gems of all the 6 rings in this portrait appear black, like how diamonds were painted, so it is not possible to discern if any of them are a ruby ring that she could have been given at her coronation. However, I surmise that Mary moved her coronation ring to the ring finger of her left hand so as to symbolize being wedded to the realm, in a strategy of self-fashioning her unprecedented role as Queen Regnant of England. If this is the case, then the coronation ring is the one closest to her heart on that finger. But then what is the other jeweled ring on the outside of her left-hand ring finger? Here, I think it is the betrothal ring that she was given by Charles V through Edgemont at the betrothal ceremony on the 6th of March. If so, that means this painting was created after the betrothal ceremony in March 1554, but before her wedding in July of that year. After Mary and Philip's wedding, Habsburg court painter Antonis More painted Mary's portrait. And More actually completed 3 nearly identical paintings of Mary in November or December 1554, just after her first pregnancy was announced. Mary had less control over these paintings, and in them she is painted as a Habsburg princess sitting regally in a chair of red brocade, holding a red coronation in her right hand. No jewels are visible on her right hand, and her left hand rests on her lap, holding a pair of brown leather gloves. She wears jewels on 3 of these fingers, proudly displaying her majesty and power through these adornments. For the version held in the Prado, that which was personally owned by Charles V, on Mary's ring finger, she has a jeweled ring closest to her heart, her coronation ring, as well as 2 plain bands. One of these bands is probably the plain band that she chose as her wedding ring. If so, this means that for the wedding ceremony, Mary removed her betrothal ring, probably moving it to another finger, and had her wedding band placed on her left hand ring finger on top of her coronation ring. Based on her spousal ring at her coronation, and Mary put her spousal ring on at her coronation and did not take it off, even for her wedding. Thus, her wedding ring had to be placed on top of it. So not only does this show her coronation ring is closer to her heart, but it also shows that her kingdom came before her husband, just as she proclaimed in her Guildhall speech. As her coronation ring is closer to her heart, this is another act of self-fashioning her marriage to her realm as having priority to her marriage with Philip. For the version of More's painting held by the Isabella Stewart Gardner Museum in Boston, Massachusetts, and Castle Ashby in Northamptonshire, England, Mary only has 1 jeweled ring on her left hand ring finger, and neither has a plain wedding band nor the betrothal ring alongside her coronation ring. This omission seems significant. It downplays her marital alliance with Philip, and the copy of More's painting held in the Isabella Stewart Gardner Museum was Mary's personal copy that she gifted to Sir Henry Jerningham after she made him captain of the Queen's Guard. The Queen also gave Jerningham Codicey Hall in Norfolk, where this painting was installed in approximately 1557. The painting remained there until July 1901, when it was purchased by dealers Dowdeswell and Dowdeswell, who sold it to Isabella Stewart Gardner the following month. The fact that Mary is not wearing either her betrothal ring or her wedding band leaves many unanswered questions. Did she choose not to include either ring, thus downplaying the Habsburg marital alliance and self-fashioning herself as a sole queen? Was this decision made by More, as Mary did not have much say over these portraits as she did as those by Eworth? And what ring or rings did Mary actually wear every day? No matter, Mary only wearing her coronation ring in these 2 variant portraits reminds the viewers that she was wedded to the realm and the laws of the same. The spousal ring, whereof I have on my finger, which never too was, nor hereafter shall be left off. Queen Mary I died on the 17th of November, 1558, after receiving last rites and hearing Mass. On the 13th of December, her body was transferred on a chariot from St. James Palace to Westminster Abbey. And on top of her casket was an effigy adorned with crimson velvet and a crown on her head, her scepter in her hand, and many goodly rings on her fingers, conveying her love of jewels in both life and death. Bishop John White delivered a hagiographical funeral sermon for the late Queen at a high requiem Mass on the 14th of December. As Carolyn Colbert points out, White's sermon was more about godly living and defending Catholicism under the new regime than it was about Mary. However, it did hearken back to Mary's coronation oath and ring as examples of her regal power and even quasi-saintliness. White preached, "In this church she married herself unto this realm, and in token of faith and fidelity did put a ring with a diamond upon her finger, which I understand she never put off after during her life, Whatsoever success things had, for that is in the hand of God only. She was never unmindful or uncareful of her promise to her realm. Here, White suggested that Mary's coronation ring had a diamond, not the traditional ruby as called for in the little device. That possibly explains why the rings on Mary's left hand finger were always painted black, like diamonds. More importantly, White downplayed Mary's marriage with Philip in favor of her union with the realm celebrated at her coronation. Even though she undertook a second marriage with a husband for the promise of children, she always revered her marriage to the realm as of superior importance. Unlike the deaths of Henry VIII and Edward VI, there was no secrecy surrounding Mary's death. Her coronation ring was immediately removed and taken to Elizabeth at Hatfield House, an event frequently dramatized in film. Like many of the ideas I've brought up today, this event begs many questions. Why did Elizabeth get Mary's coronation ring immediately upon her succession? Did Elizabeth use the same ring at her coronation? And did she wear it prior to her coronation? Mary and Elizabeth had other parallels regarding their coronation rings as well. Elizabeth invoked her coronation oath and ring when counselors suggested that she marry. And Elizabeth also wore her coronation ring every day until her death, when it had to be cut off of her finger because her flesh had grown around it. And I hope to follow up on some of these questions and parallels in a longer version of this. While Mary's Guildhall speech is important for several reasons, one often overlooked aspect is her mention of her spousal or coronation ring. No matter the exact language that she used, as printed versions of her speech recall her language differently, Mary regarded the ring she received at her coronation to be her spousal ring, a ring that symbolized her commitment as a female king wedded to her realm. Though she was going to undertake a second marriage, that to Philip of Spain, this second marriage should greatly advance this realm, whereunto she was first married, to much honor, quiet, and gain. Thus Mary presented herself as a wife to Philip, a role traditionally understood for a queen, yet at the same time, husband to England, a masculine and unchartered role for an English regnant queen. Through Mary's invocation of her coronation ring at pivotal moments in her reign, we can get a better understanding of her self-fashioning as both a wife and a monarch. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Valerie, and thank you for bearing with me while I run around today. That was absolutely wonderful and really gives us an insight into what this portrait means. So thinking not just about the material culture of monarchy, but what that material culture means and its symbolism. So thank you so much. We've got some time for questions. So for everyone to hear online, I'll need to pass around a microphone. So if you have a question in the room, please put up your hand and I'll bring a microphone to you. And if you're online, please post a question in the chat. Thank you.
Thank you. That was fascinating. As somebody who studied the Tudors at A level a long time ago, I came away with the Bloody Mary cliche. And I've increasingly come to admire her. Just the way she took matters into her own hand at the succession after the death of Edward. Following on from your lecture, how far do you think she influenced Elizabeth about having a husband, being wedded to the country, and being wise about perhaps dealing with the possibility of rebellion against her?
Those are great questions. So I agree. I think that the moniker of Bloody Mary is kind of, for scholars anyway, it's kind of over, as there's more recognition that she did do more in her reign than burn Protestants, right? So it was a short reign, but there's more to it than just that. I think she did greatly influence Elizabeth. especially regarding marriage. I think her father probably also had a nice influence on that too. But Mary and Elizabeth, which seems odd, but they were actually close for a long time. So Mary and Elizabeth were in the same place for a lot of these events. Even when Mary was confined when she thought she was going to give birth, Elizabeth was there. So I think Elizabeth really had a firsthand look at what was happening and probably could take away the positives and the negatives of marrying a foreign prince and how you would navigate that as Queen of England. So what kind of power would that prince have? Marriage, even on a personal level. So how do you navigate being an obedient wife, yet in charge politically, which I think would have been a very challenging balance to have. So I think that Mary did greatly influence Elizabeth, although I also do think Elizabeth did intend to marry and just didn't, because she always was aware that these concerns could crop up and how would she be pulled into foreign invasions. And I do think that she influenced her that way. I think she also influenced her certainly in how she would rule things. So Mary, in many ways, was the test case of how females could rule within England. So how to navigate your privy council, how to navigate your counselors, how to navigate your household, and work both in a male and female realm together, and even run the Church of England as a female, which would have been not possible, and how to navigate that. So I do think that Elizabeth took quite a bit from Mary, and just because her reign is so much longer and she had the time to prove herself in these moments, we tend to remember Elizabeth's achievements more than Mary's.
We've had a question from our online audience asking if the spousal ring survives, and if so, where is it today?
No, there's not that much 16th century jewelry that survives at all. So if you'd like to see and even if it did, I think Cromwell might have destroyed it in the interregnum. It seems like all the crown jewels, except for I think the spoon and ampulla, are gone. So the coronation ring is very, very likely gone. The new one from 1841, I think that's the date, is currently with the crown jewels. Not the one that Victoria used. And I love that the jeweler that made Victoria's coronation ring got the finger wrong. So when they said fourth finger, he counted like this and made it for her pinky, but your fourth finger is actually your ring finger. So at her coronation, it got stuck. And she writes in her diary that after her coronation, she had to go home, put her hand in an ice bath to get the coronation ring off. And then they sized it so it would fit. So the coronation rings, I think, are just fun as a whole. But no, Mary's does not exist that we know of.
Thank you, Valerie. That's a really interesting talk. And, obviously, we've been talking about a lot about this. In terms of like the spousal ring, obviously, we know it was diamond thanks to Wyatt. Do you think she didn't choose the ruby because the diamond's all about constancy? And, she's that constant monarch, the one who's been the true faith, that constant, the people's princess, and now she's suddenly become queen. Do you think that's why she chose diamonds, really? And do we know anything more about any of her other rings? Because, looking at her privy purse expenses, her father's portraits and everything else, do we know if she wears any of her father's rings? Because obviously she wears her mother's cross, the pendants from the English crown jewels, and she does inherit her father's jewels. I don't know, does she actually wear some of his rings to sort of have that connection?
I'm not sure yet. So the jewel connection is the one that I'm trying to work through. And I think I got here backwards because I went through the jewel connection of her pearl. And that's very contentious, whose pearl is the actual pearl. So whether it's the one that, Elizabeth Taylor wore and let her dog chew on, or whether it's the one that's currently in the Spanish crown jewels, these jewels, we still don't have straight lines of whose they were and where they came from, because Mary could very well be wearing jewels in this portrait or in that portrait that belonged to the Spanish crown jewels that were given over from Charles. We know that Charles gave Mary both the betrothal ring and rings on her wedding day. So she could be wearing any of these rings or rings that belonged to her mother, her father, any of her stepmothers, because the jewels may have been recycled, repurposed. I'm not convinced there's not rubies on that coronation ring somewhere and that we just don't see them. So it certainly appears to be a diamond ring, but the ruby was tradition and still is. The coronation ring is still rubies and sapphires. So there could very well have been rubies in that ring somehow, but we just don't see them in this portrait because of how it's painted or the level of detail. So I'm not sure if she picked diamond especially, and I don't know if we'll be able to specifically identify where each of these rings came from.
I had a question, if I may, about your research process and the fact that you've already said the ring itself doesn't survive. Their effigies are so striking for how the material of what survives contrasts with the elaborate, rich, lavish descriptions of them. And I noticed in your presentation, you've got a few different sources there, so from, say, the 18th and 19th centuries. So what are the challenges for you, and how do you approach those challenges when you're dealing with a lot of loss?
I think there's lots of different sources I have to try to consult. So traditionally, I'm a historian of the book, so I tend to go to the written sources. So I'm most interested in the versions of the Guildhall speech and how Mary invoked the ring. So I'm interested in the printed history, the reception, how the ring is invoked in the different versions of the speech given by Proctor, Wyatt, Christopherson, Cardinal Pole, and the anonymous ones that are currently sitting in Spain that were sent back intentionally to Charles V to see what happened at Mary's coronation. So you have to use those written sources, some of which no longer exist in their original form and only exist in 18th and 19th century printed versions, which we don't know if they are 100% accurate to their originals, but they're as close as we can get. But then you also have to go to the material sources like this. So we have the paintings, and there's loads and loads of paintings of Mary, but truthfully, they're all kind of derived after Eworth and Moore. So the ones later that look very similar, we can't necessarily count as truly original as to what Mary would have been wearing on her fingers every day. And then the other sources are something like what Peter mentioned, so expense accounts and inventories. So what did Mary own? What did she buy? What did she inherit? And then what did she give away? And then you will find every once in a while something like John White's sermon for the end of Mary's life. But his sermon is full of inaccuracies. So he says she wears a diamond ring. And I guess we have to accept it because he's the only person who describes it. But his sermon is riddled with lots of other inaccuracies. So we kind of have to take all these different sources and compare them to see what we can come up with, which is what I've been starting to do.
That's fascinating, because it's not just the materials, but the reception of those materials then, and how people were thinking about them and communicating them. Any further questions online or in the room?
Thank you very much. That was really interesting, Valerie. Obviously, you've been through a lot of sources, and you mentioned that you have a preference. But historically, you preferred the written. I wonder to what extent there are records kept of the court, things like inventories over the period of the Tudor monarchs, which might shed some light on objects that are passed down through different reigns.
In Mary's privy purse accounts, they exist for her time as princess, and they stop around 1544, but there are notes in them in her own hand of things she later gives away. So we have a few records that way, but they're not complete after her accession. And then there are records of Henry VIII's jewels and various inventories of Henry VIII's that you can go through, and so you can see jewels that he bought and purchased and had made for his children and his wives and some of his close friends. But the records for Mary's reign aren't as complete. And whether that's because they weren't as complete at the time or they're lost since, because sometimes the record keeping for Mary was intentionally lost once Elizabeth took the throne. So it's harder to find these types of inventories for Mary's reign specifically, which is why it's harder to detail exactly what what she has materially. And I have a feeling that if we were to ever find them, they'd be in Spain and not England, which is perhaps why they also don't appear anymore. So after her death, lots of the Spaniards left, lots of her own ladies left and exiled themselves into Spain and took some of her things with them. So I think if we were to find some of these inventories, that's where they're going to be hidden in Simancas or the Bibliothèque Nationale or something, but not in England.
I wonder if we can take advantage of the fact that you're here with the portrait. And I was just wondering if there's anything else that you wanted to share about the portrait, or indeed anything else you're aware of in the Society's collections that is relating to your research.
I have been using the Society's collections quite a bit lately for my research, not related to the portrait specifically, but I am, as you can kind of tell with the Guildhall speech, I'm very interested in Mary's first year as queen. And one of my bigger projects going forward is going to be her first pregnancy. So really her first 12 or 18 months as queen. And the Society has some great records. Right before this talk, I was reading the record of her coronation, which is sitting upstairs in a manuscript. And it is bound with 2 records of Edward VI's coronation, which were specifically written for her to prepare for her own, to see what kind of blend of coronation she wanted to have, using the medieval tradition and that by her grandfather, Henry VII, and changing it to be specifically for a queen regnant. So there are great records of her coronation upstairs. And there's also lots of ballads. There's not that many left, but that were written during Mary's reign. Most of them exist only in one copy, and they're in this building. So the Society has been great for finding out more about specifically the first year of Mary's reign.
Well, thank you again to Valerie and to all of you for joining us in person and online. Our next lunchtime lecture, you don't have to wait very long, is going to be on Tuesday, where we're going to hear from Mike Pitts, FSA, about what went wrong in Rapa Nui. So huge thank you again to Valerie for a wonderful lecture.
I'll be back.